to be transported by trucks. However, we are strengthening the standards for our heavy-duty vehicles at the same time. So it stands to reason that railroads shouldn't be left to lead the race to the bottom. Everyone else is increasing their standards, promulgating regulations for everybody else. California's doing that as well. And the railway industry wants to be on the side. So, Ms. Torres, the rail industry claiming that moving freight by rail is more efficient than moving freight by truck, is that going to remain true in California, especially considering the recent agreement between the state and truck manufacturers to create a path to achieve 100% zero-emission truck sales?
As of this year, it will be cleaner and healthier for communities to transport by trucks. Unfortunately, rail is falling behind on its negligence to invest in zero emissions technology that is already here. We are not against rail or the freight system. We just want to electrify to have some relief to our communities that are exposed to these carcinogenic diesels.
So you believe, Ms. Torres, that it is possible to address emissions from both heavy-duty trucks and from locomotives at the same time?
Yes, it is. It is very possible and very needed to address both of those emissions, not just looking at the greenhouse gases, but at the health aspect too of what we call air pollutants.
No, absolutely. Mr. Rosen, are the railroads buying green locomotives at a rate that is maxing out your production?
We're in the single digits when we could be producing 1,000 of Tier 4 and some mix within that of green locomotives that aren't being completely non-emitting. But again, replacing the worst that's out there right now with Tier 4 as a stopgap while we make the bigger transition is well worth doing, and they need to make up for lost time by doing that. But we could be starting to get a lot of the green locomotives out the door, and the orders aren't there.
Yes, so Ms. Torres, could you briefly elaborate on the disproportionate health and economic burdens faced by communities near rail yards? We'll come back to you, Ms. Torres.
Hello.
Yep, Ms. Torres, could you hear my question?
Yes, sorry, the hybrid world. My apologies. Yeah, these communities of color and low-income communities are the ones who deal with the diesel emissions at higher rates, both particular matter 2.5 and NOx. It's not just the diesel coming from the locomotives, but diesel coming from switchers that are as older than us in the room. The equipment that is being used in the rail intermodal facilities in the port. I know folks have mentioned that there's work to get those into low emissions, but the technology has been there for a lot of that here to be zero emissions. That could be something that eases a lot of that burden on community. Not only are we seeing those impacts, like I mentioned, there's the noise, the light, and many of you all know, living by rail lines and rails, that are still not looked into. A lot of our community grows vegetables and fruits. We don't know what is being contaminated by the diesel of the years going through their yards, if there's water pollution or soil pollution, because unfortunately, if the data is out there, we don't see it. We don't see data from the rail yards. So as of now, what is known is the air quality impacts because we have done that research. I would love to see the rail's research on all the other impacts.
Yeah, so we know it's real. You know, when I was a boy, I grew up in Ward 2 in Malden. Every city has an environmental sacrifice ward. So I grew up in that ward. I told you, trains were on one block this side, 3 blocks the other side. The Malden River was 3 blocks and the train rode right next to the Malden River, but next to the Malden River was also the coal company, the chemical company, every Commerce All-Star was made right along the Malden River. There was always a big cloud over Ward 2 with all of the factory spewing toxics going up into the air. And when you're 10 years old and your mother says, Eddie, whatever you do, don't swim in the Malden River. It made a lot of sense when you looked at it because it was black with a pre-Jimi Hendrix purple haze over it. You know? So I knew I wasn't Tom Sawyer on the Mississippi, okay? I knew that. And I also knew that I lived in that ward, okay? Ward 3 wasn't like that. Ward 5 wasn't like that. They were nice tree-lined streets, but not Ward 2. We had a different life. Trains, polluted river, factories, and obviously the health consequences were run by people who live in Ward 2, not Ward 3, not Ward 5, Ward 7. It was right there in Ward 2. So we all know this now in retrospect, how obvious that was. You can't use a river as a dumping ground for all of this stuff. You can't use the air. You can't use the land to do it. And I guess, Mr. Jeffries, that's all we're really saying to your industry. You just got to move with the times. You just got to move with it, okay? And electric is the future. And we have to move much more substantially towards the mitigation of the harms which are run by those people who live in the environmental sacrifice zones. And that's where your trains are. That's where the diesel trucks are. And across the board, we're trying to solve that problem because we know that there are higher levels of asthma or of cancers that people suffer from. And while we know you have to have a bottom line and returns to shareholders, there's also a responsibility to deal with the consequences of the way in which you move your trains around the country. And so this is just going to be a spotlight that's going to increase in its intensity on your industry, Mr. Jeffries. That's all I want to tell you. It's not going away. Everyone else realizes the time has come, the jig is up. We gotta do something here to protect those people who live in those areas. And increasingly, even in Ward 2, they now are more black, they're more brown. You know, they replaced the families that have already moved on to Ward 3 and, you know, Ward 5 and Ward 7. So that's really the challenge, these people who get left behind and suffer the consequences for it. And we just shouldn't really accept that. And we just hope your industry will go back and reevaluate this obstinate, obdurate opposition that you have and the denialism that you're bringing in terms of your goals, because there's so much more that you could do and do it in a cost-effective way. So let me turn to you, Chair.